Good morning. Welcome back to the Green Hour. This is your host, Fatemah Sultan. I am currently sitting here with this is something I'm very excited to get into because I've really been interested in academia when it comes to talking about the climate crisis and the world of climate. So today joining us is Miss Sana, because you are a teacher, right? You also are a professor. You're a teacher. So I'll say Miss Sana Gondal, who's an urban and environmental planner based in Karachi. You're also a lecturer at Habib University, and you work on urban issues regarding the climate and gender, connecting to academia and public policy and systems around it. And you know, something that I've been a fan of for a really, really long time is Karachi Bachao Tehreek, which is where Sana also works as well. And I've been following them for 2-3 years now, and very extensively, and I definitely am really excited to get into it. But good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So how are you today? Are you excited? Are you ready to get into it? What is your expectations of this conversation?
I don't know. I think it'll be interesting because it's a conversation I know has already generated a little bit of buzz online because it's a topic that people are curious about.
Yeah.
And I'm sure everyone has their own opinions too.
Actually, everyone has really interesting opinions, which is why I think it's so important to focus on where academia sits into it, because I think academia covers every aspect of human society, and if we don't connect that to such a big problem in today, we won't understand the problem to its extent, which is why I'm really excited to get into this conversation. But thank you for coming on today. I am very excited to speak to you.
Likewise.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I have initially is, for people who are listening, can you tell us a little bit more about Karachi Bachao Tehreek and how you got into it and how it's related to your work in academia as well?
Right. So Karachi Bachao Tehreek is a progressive grassroots movement. Mm-hmm. It's essentially एक awam ki एक movement hai, and it came out of a need because after the floods in Karachi in 2020, essentially when Karachi flooded, blame was a blame game started. Mm-hmm. And what the government understood was that the reason that there's an urban flooding happening all the time is because the stormwater drains that we have, the natural ones, are blocked because of waste, trash. तो अब जो नाले हैं उनको साफ करना होगा. लेकिन उसके साथ other things were packed in, which were people's homes. अचानक से what they realized was कि नाले की सफाई के साथ आपको लोगों के घर अब तोड़ने पड़ेंगे. And no one understood why this was happening. They were not given a notice.
No,
people were just essentially and it was a very violent and brutal way that this was done.
Completely.
Because आपको notice नहीं, imagine करो कि someone tells you in one day आपको एक pamphlet मिलता है, एक general one, which your neighbors also get. So nothing specific to your case, कि आपको कल सुबह 4 बजे तक अपना घर खाली कर दे, अपना सामान ले जाए, वरना आप तोड़ देंगे और हम रिस्पॉन्सिबल नहीं होंगे इसके लिए. और फिर पुलिस ब्रुटैलिटी होती है कि वो टीयर गैस लेकर आ जाएगी, वो शेलिंग करेंगे, एटसेट्रा. And this happened in multiple different neighborhoods across Karachi.
Like Rangi Town, Gujranwala. And that is something that I was there actually in, I think, 2021 when there was a court case decision with the Sindh High Court, and how there were all of these different citizens of Gujranwala and Rangi Town. And I spoke to them and they told me about how they'd been living in these areas for 30-40 years, and because it was a different government that gave them their residential permits, other governments were saying that they were no longer legal because they didn't issue them. And it was just insane speaking to people and understanding they have everything in place, and the way they were just pushed out of their homes is so related to one of the offsets of the climate crisis, because you blame the lower income, the
most vulnerable,
and the working
marginalized
class
people that you can find, you blame them.
Yes.
And then also the narrative is so malicious, right? Because you say कि ये तो कब्जा था, illegal था, encroachment थी. Yes, लेकिन कच्चा का ये मतलब नहीं कि उनका कच्चा is just the paper का format. जो most of Karachi का अगर आप देखें तो वो ऐसे ही है. Because हम लोग we're a product of partition.
Yes.
So when a lot of migrants came in, there were just no spaces.
You should be even kinder.
Exactly.
Story.
And this all feeds into the vulnerabilities that you have because of this, right? Because जब बारिश आती है तो हाँ पूरा शहर डूबता है, लेकिन कुछ लोग ज़्यादा डूब रहे हैं, कुछ लोग ज़्यादा मर रहे हैं, उनकी नौकरियाँ जा रही है, और फिर वो क्या करे? So iske andar you can see the intersections over here, how much it targets certain communities.
And as the climate crisis gets more aggravated in today, because I know that like Karachi Bachao was doing their work way before even the last year floods. Like last year floods probably aggravated it even more, because from what I remember, I was following Karachi Bachao in 2021, and then last year's floods and even this year's like mismanagement has just made these things worse. And how do you think this is something that like civil society in Karachi, especially the ones who are educated and have these opportunities to actually advocate and support like other communities in Karachi, how can they get involved?
I think they need to start paying attention, and unki involvement sabse zaruri hai, because
100%.
the most unfortunate thing is, while you've got thousands of people impacted, affected, and wo protest bhi karte, wo aate hai, we're constantly publishing either articles or something on social media trying to rally people. We need people with social capital to get behind it, so they can amplify the message, because we know what this country's like system is like. So unless someone with power and authority makes noise, unfortunately attention nahi milegi, and that means every day kisi ki zindagi mein aap, you know, you could have helped them throughout, and wo nahi ho raha. So you have to get behind. So if you're educated, if you've got a platform, if you've got anyone who's actually listening to you, and if you're in that position of authority, then I feel like it is so much more of your responsibility to amplify other people's voices, because they've been saying everything, and there's so much to learn over here. So your education, I don't think it means much unless you do with it. And that's what like the central tenet, I think, of this conversation is as well. Like, what does academia actually do for climate justice?
What's the point of research papers and writings and readings if it doesn't connect to like community and the essence of like human society? And I feel like that's so in relation to what you're talking about. Like, what's the point of all of these big research projects on Karachi and how to manage it, and like immigrant communities that become big cosmopolitan cities, if you're not even going to learn how to listen to the majority of the people who live here? And that, I don't think people even think this is related to the climate crisis, which is why I wanted to like share that conversation, because I think when people view Karachi, they see it just as a settlement that has grown and grown and grown, and they don't understand that the way we've grown is so unsustainable, with like pushing the ocean back. Why do we flood as much as we do? We literally live on the ocean floor. Like, these are things that don't register with most of Karachi. Like, people don't know that. And I think it's very important, as you said, to connect academia into how does it even help us. And if there's something that you would say to your students, for an example, like as they're like growing up and they're entering these fields and they're like graduating from university, what would you say, like be it in STEM, be it in social sciences, med school, whatever, how would you say that people from different backgrounds, educational backgrounds especially, should get involved with like sustainable action?
I think like there are so many different layers to this, right? The ek hai ki what kind of education are people receiving in the first what kind of education are you receiving? So for example, I've got my master's in urban environmental planning, and I studied in the US for that. And I've got my bachelor's in social development policy, and I studied in Karachi, Pakistan for that. So what was the difference in like the way that climate essentially was framed in different spheres of the world, right? I felt like Pakistan was a lot more in touch with, because we are impacted more, but this is also before I think like things have progressively gotten worse in the past 5-6 years.
100%.
But this is, I'm talking about like 2014, for example. I was introduced to words like the Anthropocene, what it means to face climate injustice in different parts of the world, etc. in my first semester, my first week of lectures, for example. And in my master's, it was my last class, perhaps, when I was graduating. God. Yeah, and then that was the first time I felt like students over there were being introduced to the concept of what this means. Yahan pe you may understand it, and you might not have the vocabulary for it, which is what academia gives you. It gives you words.
It empowers you.
Exactly. It gives you the vocabulary that you need to be able to, like, you know, translate all of these different things into either research or action to some extent, right? But that cognitive dissonance over there, like within the global north, which is responsible with, you know, capital, with all of, like, essentially responsible for so much. So there were like that dissonance in education. I think like that's one of the first things. But yahan pe, unfortunately, we really don't prioritize the environment as like a central, again, like theme. And you think that, for example, like your discipline might be divorced from like ye cheez is kind of
biodiversity and tree plantings has nothing to do with the urban communities that are overflooding. They don't connect the problems.
They don't always connect, and that's like a huge issue because
it's
we're all connected deeply into this, right?
Exactly. It's why intersectionality is my favorite word to use here.
Yeah, and it's the most essential thing because like the issues that you face then is how do you get people to buy in to action unless like they don't know about it. So like that's where education is very important. But in academia, like academia is an institution, right? So the way that its own structure works is that you've got people who are given grant money first by certain organizations to do that research, and if that's the case, then that means you are kind of beholden to give them results that they're seeking. So it's kind of rigged. And then when you do your research, you have to publish it behind paywalls. So you can't, like, the general public might not be able to access that information anyway. And then imagine if you're doing qualitative primary research, then that means आप in communities में जाके बातें करते, आप उनसे आप उनकी कहानियाँ सुनते हो, and then you put them in some kind of medium. But usually the people that you've interviewed or the people that you've spoken to, you do nothing else for them. You publish under your name, and then your career kind of exceeds, and then you become the climate expert. But the voices that you were speaking to, the ones that desperately need to be amplified, are not always amplified in that way. And I struggle with this a lot as a researcher. Like when I'm talking to people and they're really, it's emotionally traumatizing. It's deeply traumatizing to talk to someone who's like, बेघर है वो, और उनके like 3-4 बेटियां हैं जो अब completely बेपर्दा है because आपके घर में दीवार नहीं है, छत नहीं है, अब आप क्या करोगे? You're exposed to the elements in that way, right? And then what do I do with that information? Like, should I publish it under my name and then present it in an international conference and then get like, a pat on my back for this? Like, what does that do for the cause
itself? Like,
so,
even like the books I read about like climate science and all of these aspects, they're usually from a global north perspective, where they come here, they look at something, they research it, they pick up these very like white savior stories, and then they publish it, and then nothing ever happens beyond it, which is why, as someone who loves research, I think it's such an untapped resource because research leads us to solutions, like big solutions. Like, I don't think I would have understood the intersectionality of it if I didn't read research, but now I know that research is just not enough. It's about putting it into practical action, and you're 100% right. It is emotionally traumatizing to hear these life or death stories, essentially, because it's do or die in these situations, and then it just becomes a paper. And and that is just, it's heart-wrenching, but I think it's because academia has not been able to water down to grassroots levels the way it should. And that's something which I think is like, it's just not there yet, but I think it can get there.
Of course, progressive movements essentially try to do that. Like, you'll always see study circles happening. You'll see, like, for example, KBT's model is like, if I was just presenting at Indus Valley University a few months ago, and like our mission was, if I'm presenting all of this, then I need to have someone who is an actual mutassirin with me the whole time, directing the way that we're going to do this as well, benefiting from whatever social capital that we get, because all of this is about social capital for like conferences, etc., is to further your professional career, but also like to be known in the network.
Scope, yes.
Yeah, exactly, right? So like, how do you keep involving their voices and giving back in that way? Because like, this is just like, it's an existential crisis of the nature of the way this works. And I think like a lot of academics right now, especially young researchers, are trying to grapple with this in a way that's a lot more I think like it's more intelligent and it's more considerate of like the practice itself. So they're trying to see how you can
I see that a lot. And I think that's really true to what like now like is going on. Like, I think as you talked about academia, it's like something that I feel like Pakistani should be really aware of. Like, the International Court of Justice released like an amendment and a clause talking about how like climate justice is related to litigation in international courts, and if countries are not meeting their climate goals, this is something that they should be sued for. And I feel like that's also related to it, because these cases are built on academia. There is nothing, as you record these stories and these like cases in a large extent, it's usually the most vulnerable being recorded, and that's actually how the Loss and Damage Fund last year came through, because it was small island states coming together in this big research-based, policy-based movement, but it was from a grassroots level. But it was all fueled and pushed through with grassroots working with academia, which is something I think Pakistan really, really needs. Sana is still here with us. Sana and I were having a really nice chat where I was just going on a rant about all the different work I do and the different projects. And yeah, and Sana, another question that I really, really want to get into is like intersectionality. It is my favorite word in these spaces, because I always say when you address one problem, you're addressing 100. And I think intersectionality is so like inbuilt with that, because even if you have one solution, it will break down into 100 different solutions, like the whole water down effect. So Sana, how do you define intersectionality, and what does it have to do with your work related to climate?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, and also the way that you framed it, I think the answer is also kind of there. It is just, intersections is where essentially, in a very literal way, you just take multiple different, for example, if it's identities, you see how they overlap, you see how they connect with one another, and how they also retain their unique identities, but you kind of have to move forward, understanding like the differences, but also where it's the same. So it's just like essentially, it is just the intersections of an issue. And you said, for example, like 100 different things, or like one solution may touch on like 100 different things, and I also feel like 100 different things essentially are trying to solve one solution sometimes,
exactly.
right? Like on the other way. So for me, it's that where you see how, so for example, if I'm talking about cities, right? Or like you asked me how my day was going this morning, and it was just completely related to all of this. So Karachi, for example, any person in Karachi right now can tell you they hate traffic, they hate commute, they hate congestion. And that one problem touches on so many different things, right? So you've got obviously carbon emissions happening, you've got a heat island effect like incoming, you've got more and more green spaces encroach for concrete, etc. You've got all of that. And then you've got me, who was trying really hard to make it over here in time, and then I had so many different car issues because there's no public transit routes. I would rather take that. My private car is never always mine, it's with my family sometimes here and there. And then if I want to Kareem, then there's so many different issues, especially with gender over here. All of the different like ways that this intersects with one problem, and like it's just like, how do I get from one place to another? But also, how does that impact like the rest of society? Because your one car driving is not just your one car driving. It's a lot of pollution, it's a lot of congestion, it's noise, it's something that takes away from the built environment. How people, like good cities, livable cities, usually don't focus this much on cars, on transit routes in this way, right? So this is just like a brief example, I guess, of what I understand.
I think that's a really good example, and even I wouldn't have thought of it like that, but that's so true, because I think everyone can kind of relate to how the mismanagement of Karachi, like in the urban planning setting, affects all of us in a really, really
every day,
disturbing
all the time,
way.
Myopic ways, like we're all intersected in our problems. That's one thing that we have to recognize. So this is where, like, for me, like, coming back to like what academia does, is like, if you can somehow bring it into collective action or collective movement, or even become an idea that's embedded in multiple people's brains and minds, and like you touch their hearts in that way, that's like, to me, because I do believe in the progressive cause. I believe in movements. I believe in, like, I don't think individuals get much done. And that's also a gimmick in the climate. Like, this is a trap, right? Like, it makes you think about your carbon emissions. It makes you think about your sustainability.
The term carbon footprint was created by British Petroleum in a PR campaign to place individual blame and create the concept of climate guilt. It was literally done by a PR firm. Like, that just shows, like, it's about distracting.
This is all a distraction, definitely.
I think in Pakistan, that's also the problem, because this was a conversation I was having yesterday or day before, where it was like, oh, like, if you're working on this, good enough, the rest of us can sit back and watch. And I was like, no way. Like, I'm 20 years old. I am not even an environmental researcher. I just do this because I genuinely think with any walk of life, you can be involved in supporting your society in some way. And climate isn't about planting trees and maintaining natural biodiversity. It is also about that, but it is so much about the mismanagement of, like, a modern human society. And I think that's what frustrates me the most, because I think there's this niche image of what like environmental activism looks like, and you're supposed to fit into this one box that you're actually placing blame on an individual, and you make people feel guilty, which is why they don't want to engage with that niche. Like, oh, you didn't plant a tree, you're a bad person. You use plastic, you're a bad person. It's about addressing why are these options even available in the first place.
Yeah. And this is, again, like, I'll bring back what the general, just like the academic system is when you talk about education, right? So the education doesn't just have to be about you understanding, okay, there's global warming, this is a climate crisis. It has to be intersectional in a way where also it's decolonial, it's also anti-capitalist, because there's no other way to put it. It has to be radical. Otherwise, it's, that quote by Hugo Chavez, it goes like, if it's not like, radical, it's just gardening. It's like,
exactly.
You can't think
I think
about
you can connect that
way.
so much. Like right now, like even saying that, people will be like, what does that even mean? What do you mean anti-capitalist? But if you look back maybe 100 years ago, even saying the word anti-colonial would be blasphemy essentially. And in a world today where we have like, we identify like our colonial roots and we say that this is where we've come from, and we do not live in a colony anymore, I think it's so connected that if that was radical change, like Pakistan in itself was born out of a radical grassroots movement with the idea of like civil freedom, and I don't know how far it's gone since then, but I think when you actually read about partition and the stories and the type of people that organized, it was so based on like the community. And that's the same with addressing this. Like, the calamities of the climate crisis are a man-made natural disaster. They are man-made. They're not just about placing the blame on like, oh, there are such few trees, this is why the entire country is in a bad place. Because I don't think people understand, especially in Pakistan, I genuinely think there's a lot of greenwashing when it came to like tree plantations, because people really felt like they were just, and I used to feel like that. That's honestly how I got involved. Like, it was through tree planting first. Like, I planted a few trees and I was like, great, now what? And then I realized that doesn't take you far.
It doesn't really, honestly, plant more trees, yes, but do it as a side hobby. Like, it doesn't have to be, it's not activism, unfortunately, in the way that you think it's supposed to be, because it doesn't matter if you plant a few trees if you're still emitting that much in terms of just like general society, the amount of carbon emission that comes out from traffic. Because you have to look at what your pollutants are, you have to look at what your contribution is to this crisis. But also, like, when I say decolonial, I also mean it in a way where you understand your place in the world and in this crisis, right? So if you're learning about this in the global north, like, which I studied over there. I've been in like 3 or 4 different exchange programs. So I've been through multiple different universities.
Yeah, and you've seen how...
Yeah, and I've seen how in like even places at Stanford, right, what is the conversation like? And you'll see like the most patronizing conversations where it's like, we have to teach them to not pollute so much, things like that.
I had the same conversation with the German Foreign Office, who's responsible for the allocation of the loss and damage fund, because an Indian guy asked her, but what do you think about like Germany's contribution? Because you've locked the loss and damage fund, but you can militarize, but you can move out $100 billion in 2 weeks when it comes to like military allocation, but you can't do that for your own financial commitments. And she just turned and said, but India is investing in coal, and India is doing this, and India is doing that, and that is the fight on a grassroots level, and that's the fight internationally. That's what I think people also don't know, that that's exactly how foreign offices are arguing with each other. It is a constant blame game, and there's this huge divide with it.
And you have to understand it as well, right? It's really nuanced over here, because like, for example, how are we supposed to move forward when we've been robbed of our resources and put back into when we were one of the richest places in the world, like when you talk about South Asia or India altogether, the subcontinent as we know it, when you've exploited us so much and taken it and forced this poverty on us, and what are we supposed to turn to in that way? But also at the same time, this cannot be an excuse that our policymakers make to further bad energy. Like, you have to focus on renewables, you have to make this into your own priority. Okay, yes, sure, I understand your country needs to have certain resources, but also how are you doing better as well? You can't only blame the global north for it. It deserves a lot of blame.
100%, but
100%.
Pakistan is not scotch-free.
Because, for example, the loss and damage funds, I was told not to name any political parties, and I won't, But it's pretty obvious, like, who is your Minister for Climate Change? How do they go about these conversations, right? I think it's really...
I was there. I
think it's really unfair when you're funding the Malir Expressway.
Yeah.
And then you're still talking about loss and damage.
Yeah.
The Malir Expressway will kill your one alive river. You have activists on the ground every day, indigenous voices. You've got people begging and screaming and dying for this.
And even the Asian Development Bank has
pulled out. They pulled out. They literally said, we're not going to fund this because, you know what? You're right. This is grossly unethical. You will kill biodiversity. You will kill ecosystems. Karachi will not have water and food. What are you going to do? But at least Darya Town will connect to DHA. You know,
that's They also were excavating an entire national park yesterday, and I saw this. And
Kirtir is completely endangered right now. The way that this
and it's for different developments outside Karachi.
It's essentially, so that's just
people don't know this, and that's what frustrates me even more, because they don't know that our water is getting stolen, like our like access to like basic sanitation, water that's probably not even clean, is getting stolen right from under us, and we're not aware of it, which is why the greenwashing conversation really frustrates me, because I think it's just like it's concealed the narrative of what's actually happening in a lot of Pakistanis' eyes, because when you see it through the media, it's so connected into this like, no, Pakistan's not a big polluter, we are the ones who need the funds, but where do those funds go, and how do they even reach on to a grassroots level? What's changed? I don't know what's changed in the last 1 year.
Yeah, like on a city level, for example, what are Pakistan's biggest emitters, who creates like the most amount of, you know, impact over here?
Yeah.
So how have you targeted those industries? How have you done anything about that? So like for me, the conversation is incomplete. You know, like the radical group Just Stop Oil, like they have a great mission, and like I want to talk more about, I guess, like what it means to be, because I think a new conversation has come up where it's like you just can't be respectable anymore about it, because
this is something we struggle a lot in these groups.
You're kind of complicit in that greenwashing conversation, because you're talking about sustainability as opposed to, you know, you're talking about the oil industry, talking about emissions, talking about the auto industry, etc. And over here, I think for Pakistan, we have to include the building industry over here, the development industry, as we call it. It's not progress. It is just a way to...
I don't think it's looking forward. I just think it's stagnant in the way it's like trying to create sustainable living. And there's so much to be learned in these fields, which is why I think it really connects, because they cannot progress if like academia also doesn't give them platforms of solutions. And that's what people really have to push for. Like something I always talk about, it's not about creating new solutions, it's also about following the policies you already have in place, like the Sindh Environmental Protection Act of 2014.
Really good, no, you've got research done, so that's just it. Academia, again, like it might have sounded as if like I'm bashing it. No, I'm talking about the methods that we use to extrapolate data and then just be extractive in a way as well, because you're not really giving anything back to certain people, because, you know, there's the scientific method kind of like it tries to make it clinical in a way where you say you're objective, you're unbiased as a researcher, because if your bias shows through, then this is not good research. But there's no such thing as an unbiased, because like you are biased, you are inherently biased by your experiences, by your identifications,
if you're a
in life,
human being observing,
you're always biased, and that bias, no matter what you're trying to do, it will show through, because to be apolitical is to also choose a side. Like there's no such thing as like apolitical. You know, it's not like that. So what you have to do is you have to be a lot more cognizant of what the impact of your research can be, because research is needed. You can't make political changes without data. You can't back it up, because
you can't change policies if you don't know why they exist.
You need the numbers, you need scientific research, you need all of that, but then you need to have something that's radical enough to be loud, to be heard, because scientists have been doing this for a very long time. All the numbers are there. The data that you need to make change
60, 70 years.
It's all there. But I think like the issue also is that, like I said, the nature of academia is you fund it. So when the opposing side is funding it to try to be like, okay, but how can we focus on sustainability? How can we focus on green energy in industries that are just like, it's essentially like those distraction techniques where you're like, we don't like the solution you've given us, so let's keep trying to look for alternative solutions that actually only further business as usual.
You know, Sana, that was another question that I kind of wanted to get into as well, like how you were talking about Just Stop Oil, and like I think it's a very good example of a global north perspective and like white saviorism. Sorry, Just Stop Oil, if you hear this, but it is very Eurocentric, activisty, white savior, let me go save the flood victims in the global south. And I think they don't even realize that the solutions have to come from the global south for the crisis to change. So what would you say, even in the academic sphere, like, is the stark difference between like the global north and the global south perspective?
I mean, I think like the first thing is that the global south perspective is so limited in terms of like the resources we have and the amount of work that comes in comparison to the global north. So unfortunately, we have great research coming out. We have work that's being done by people who are really thoughtful, have been adding their voices to this, like in different ways, right? Because it's not just climate, it's also, for example, like, because I look at urban policies and urban planning, right? So in terms of cities, but you have work that's being done since the 90s or since the 70s, etc. You've got work in just like the decolonial field altogether. You've got work in gender, etc. All of this has been dying to environmentalism or climate change in some way or the other, and it progresses. So they are like the foundations of, like, you know, on what you would build your work on or respond to, etc. So you've got great work done. But I think in terms of the voice or the sheer number, then our numbers are less and there should be more. And our numbers should be more because I think we have a lot more to add in a way that, because if you're more in touch with the crisis, I think you can be more sincere to solutions as opposed to offering them just because it furthers, like, it ends a paper, it ends a research in that way. I think like that is the first disparity over here. Our voices just are not as much, or we're underrepresented in either journals or conferences, etc. You just have a lot of tokenism in a lot of these spaces.
We are 100% underrepresented in conferences.
So I think like that's like the first issue, that either if there's like a lack of funding or a lack of just access to some certain spaces, etc. So you've got like that disparity. But then I think like one issue that I personally had when I was reading, for example, if I was studying it, like, because I mentioned this at the start over here, okay, I did my master's in the US, but I did my undergrad in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, I got to learn, I think, like the best things that have formed my understanding of like the world in itself, but also especially what climate over here means, or what the earth means, or the value of nature, the value of, you know, our relations with other organisms, etc. But what I understood in the global north, the papers that were given to me, my readings, my syllabi, my curriculum, etc., it was very much focused on what I like, a greenwash, like, sustainability perspective. Like, how can we sustain, but we don't need to, this is unsustainable. So like the biggest contention over here is you won't call the spade, like you won't call the problem capitalism, you won't call it white supremacy, so you'll call it something else, right? And it's really polite in that way, and I don't agree with that. Like, I think it's useless. If anything, it was a waste of my time. I felt like I was in my I liked the professor a lot, but like, for example, my classroom, I was depressed out of my mind because when my education started, for example, I was in Pakistan. COVID was the pandemic had closed borders, so I was taking my classes from Karachi. First week of my university, my city flooded, so I didn't have running water in my house for 1 week. I didn't have electricity for 5 days. I didn't have phone signals for 3 days. Like, there was, you know, and my family and I are just looking at each other in the dark in like just like this horrible condition, just looking at each other's faces because there's nothing else to do, and then the power is out, and then you're stuck at home. There's nothing to do. And at the same time, the conversation is happening in my classroom.
It's so out of touch.
Completely out of touch. And it was very like on the nose for me as well, because again, I'm looking at cities and looking at city planning. So their issues are like zoning and parking, etc. And I'm like, okay, you will never understand actually what the urgency is, what the you know, things like how it could actually work in this context, etc. You are devoid of that, and it's really easy to talk about certain things without understanding like the complexity. So I think like that is one of my from my perspective, this is what my frustrations have always been. Okay, when I read some voices, they're very liberal, and I don't buy into that at all. I think like liberalism does a huge disservice to any movement of urgency because it is like a very sweet middle ground. It's very nice. It's
polite.
It's polite in a way where it's like, I will pretend to be better than, like, for example, far right systems, but at the same time you're so to the right anyway. Like, it doesn't
out
do
of
anything.
Touch.
Exactly. So I think like
that's exactly like what I was like experiencing as well. Like, it was like we were getting our evacuation notices in Sindh for the hurricane that never came, or the storm that never came, and like I'm sitting there and I'm watching people talk about Pakistan. Essentially, these are foreign offices. They have hundreds and billions of dollars to their access, and they're the ones deciding where it goes. Is it going to adaptation? Is it going to mitigation? Is it going to loss and damage? Is it going to go here? Is it going to NDCs? And all of these things affect Pakistan drastically. And I'm literally looking at my phone on one side, watching 100,000 people be evacuated, and on the other side, there are these people who are talking about a problem as if it's like years away. And it was just so frustrating, because I think there's this really broken mindset that Pakistanis have, is that you learn about the world when you leave Pakistan. I feel like there's a lot that you can learn from here. Like, I feel like everything you need to learn about the world.
Are you kidding me? No one can teach you what you can learn.
Exactly,
like, over
here.
And your people are supposed to teach you.
Yeah, and you can connect that to what you learn in other countries 100%. But I think it's a really bad perspective that, like, Pakistanis carry. But I think that's mainly in line with women, because women do not have as many opportunities to go out independently here. So for them, it's different. But there's so much to learn in the global south for what you need to know about the world.
I'm not even sure if it's just women. I think it's just the way that, once again, because like we don't recognize how much of an influence we have because of like our colonial background. We have this inbuilt like belief that the global north has things to teach us. Whatever we have is inherently worthless in a way. So for example, like I work with the community in Badin, and they face some of the worst just like the impacts of flooding every year. And a lot of this is completely initiated by the World Bank's project. And they only take in their own consultants that come from, again, their countries and have no idea of either context or understanding of our native, like, water systems, etc. You never talk to the people who live next to the river because you think they're stupid, because you think they're uneducated and they have nothing to add, like no value to add over here. Except they will tell you how the river goes, and you should listen to that, because all the problems that they're facing right now is because they had no locus standi, they had no people don't listen to them, and people dismiss what they have to say. If you would listen to indigenous voices, you would understand how systems are over there, contextually over there, and then they wouldn't have to suffer it as much, because you can come in with your project. That's a problem with like consultancy based projects, etc. You come in from a very like superficial point of view, and then you bounce once your project is done. Whatever the damage is, you can put a report in, but you don't come back and fix it. You don't come back and fix any problem. And also, you can't fix that problem because you don't have the solution. To believe that you have the solution.
Especially consultants who are like from the global north working in the global south, it's again like the same aspects of like colonialism. Like
it is. It's all an imperialist. Like it's a completely imperialist system. And even the consultants that they hire that are local consultants, they don't really have the freedom to be as honest about things because their job depends on them being, once again, polite. To be liberal enough to be like, okay, I'm a consultant because this actually furthers my career. It pays better than anything else does over here, so I'll do this project. But at the same time, like if you were to actually say this is horrible, this is completely wrong, don't do it, you would just not be hired and they'll hire somebody else, because that's how disparity works. People are starved for opportunity over here, and these are the opportunities that we get. So it is altogether a disparate system.
100%. I think you wrapped that up so well, and I think you really like hit it on the nail for what I want to like talk about and what I want to share, and how I feel like we really focus on the actual root problems, which isn't really known to the Pakistani public. Like, as I said, greenwashing is so imminent here, so we limit like environmental change only into biodiversity, but we don't think about it on a big picture. And I think this is really connected into like the further conversations that civilians essentially need to ask themselves when branching out, because these problems are affecting everyone on a drastic level, and some way more and some way less, but they are all there and you can't ignore the elephant in the room. So before we close off, I always like to ask every different guest, like, what's something that you'd want to debunk about the work that you do?
So I do a lot of different work, right? So like in research, I don't think I'll touch on that right now, but maybe I'll touch, because we started with KBT, Karachi Bajao Tehreek, and just the work that we do. I think a lot of people think that, you know, you're just angry activists who are just going to be protesting, and you're just anti-government, you're anti like everything, and you don't really know how to build relationships or work. But like that's probably the biggest I think myth of it, because when you build relationships with actual people, the awam, and you make a mass movement, you're building relationships, but you need to see what your part is in either furthering or obstructing justice. So I guess like the debunking over here would just be really nice, and we want you to be a part of this as opposed to being on the opposite side or worse, apathetic.
Exactly. Thank you so much for wrapping that up for us. I'm really happy that I had you on here today. I feel like you touched on everything that I really love to get into, and I really, really appreciate this. Thank you so much for coming on to the Green Hour.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is 11. We will be moving on to a song, and please tune in next week for the Green Hour. We will be focusing on public policy next week, and I'm really excited because I think every civilian needs to know about public policy. So yeah, thank you so much. Tune in next Friday, 10 o'clock, to listen to the Green Hour with Fatemah Sultan. Bye!